This video is going to outline the issues I had with my 2001 Honda Civic during the first year of the K-Series being in the chassis. I'll leave a link in the description that will be the next video once it's posted that outlines all the steps it took to get the K-Series in, and that'll help you better understand how the car progressed. The car was originally equipped with a D17, and the buddy club shifter was installed before I'd purchased the car. It came from an RSX, which is completely interchangeable on the shifter side. The cables themselves are different for the length. But it has this slop in it that you just can't get rid of. And it's not inside the shifter, it's inside the cables just from wear and tear. And you ultimately have to replace it with new cables, whether aftermarket or OEM. Another issue I had was with a busted oil filter. The oil filter on the K-Series sits up very high on the back of the motor, and there is an intermediate shaft and parts of the exhaust that are in the way that should stop anything from coming up off the road and hitting it. On my way to work that morning, I had ran over something, made it to work with no issue. It was raining, didn't see any oil leaking out of it or didn't pay attention to it. It wasn't until I'd left that day when it was dry that I could see oil hitting the header, evaporating, creating smoke. I stopped, checked it, and immediately found the source of the leak. Went to the parts store, replaced the oil filter, and I was on my way. The exhaust problems were pretty trying. I started out with a no-name exhaust off of the donor car, an EP3, and it was close. The muffler was the biggest problem out of all of it, but it's just a full stainless catback with an aftermarket catalytic converter and then a matching unbranded header, completely bolt-on, flange, just like OEM. The muffler was slightly too short and sat a little bit high, and resulted in melting the bumper when I was on my way to Florida. The exhaust gases just eventually backed up to the point where it bubbled the paint. To rectify the issue, I would be replacing the muffler with a 2.5-inch stainless muffler, a little bit larger, that would help quiet down the exhaust as well, and I could position it the way it was needed to get a proper exit on the exhaust, as it was melting more of my bumper daily. There was also this horrendous rattle that would resonate throughout the full exhaust, and it ultimately ended up being the unbranded muffler as began to fall apart internally, began to fail, and with it, the noise quality and the increased volume became a problem. The 2.5-inch muffler ultimately solved both the location issue when I TIG welded it back on, and the noise issue that it also created with internal parts rattling at high RPMs or varying RPMs. The single most frustrating failure was the day the exhaust fell off of it. Now, the header had a V-band welded to it, and it had a flex pipe with a second V-band on it, just for ease of installation and a little less rigidity throughout the exhaust flex. On a 20-minute drive one day, the header separated from what the V-band was welded to, and it was a press-on insert that was just a spacer for the donut that an OEM gasket would sit on, and you'll get a chance to hear it while I was both driving and while it was idle. You can see how it fell off in the last clip.
Bruh.
The attention to what failed on this was fairly obvious once I was able to see the V-band still intact, but the material it was welded to had simply separated from the header. And this material was originally only made to be a spacer. It was simply pressed on to the header with no welds, nothing. And I welded to it using it as a structural part to hold the exhaust. Now the fix was fairly easy. I unclamped the V-band, pulled the header off the car, pressed the V-band and the spacer back onto the exhaust, and I MIG welded, stitched around the flange and the spacer, and the flange is welded to the header itself. I made sure that it was proper, and since then I haven't had any issues. The Exedy clutch failure was unforeseen in the aspect that I was still breaking in the car. I was still getting a feel for the maintenance I'd have to provide to the car. With that being said, the car is equipped with an Omni Power master cylinder, which cuts the travel in half, and it does have a stop behind the pedal that limits you and stops the clutch master cylinder from over traveling the slave and the clutch pack itself. The suspension is fairly rigid. It does have poly bushings in the lower control arms and form and function Type 1 suspension, but it's still on a very hard compound tire. It gives it plenty of slip. And how the clutch failed was the clutch disc itself and the housing that holds the sprung assembly. That piece bounced around inside and would catch on the clutch disc. The pressure plate removed the seemed like the clutch was indicating a problem with drivability. Luckily, I was on my way to work. It's about a 45-minute drive, about 30 miles. I was able to then drive the car home, transmission, find a comparable replacement for what happens to be a competition clutch. Full replacement pack. Drove up there next day, picked up the clutch, installed it that weekend, had no issues. When I began to look at how the clutch failed, why the clutch failed, it wasn't from abuse. It was from an error in manufacturing, an error in material choice, an error in heat treat. The components weren't of the same standard I was used to for less powerful engines. The car had not been driven by anybody but me and had not been driven hard yet. The contributing factor was simply the clutch. The clutch lasted about 10,000 miles, drove fine, had no engagement issues, had no pressure plate or clutch disc issues. The clutch still failed. Thanks for taking a look at the video. Hopefully I can bring some insight to how the car went together, the stuff where I made mistakes, the errors in my ways, and the parts that contributed to the overall enjoyment of the car. I'll be making more content based on the vehicles that I currently own, other projects that I have, and include those in various forms on the channel. Hopefully I can up my production game to where I can post videos weekly, I can create content weekly, if not more often, and contribute more to the how to, the why, the where, how to get the projects that you have in a similar state, or at least similar ideas, parts, exposure to anybody viewing these videos. Thanks.